our faith as Christians is under attack in many ways from the society around us. And these kind of micro-monasteries we have in our homes, that those habits that we probably should be cultivating anyway, we need to continue even after the quarantine is over. So I'd like to say a few things about monasticism in the early history of the church. Monasticism is probably not a word that many of us use on a regular basis. This just has to do with monks. It's what monasticism is, the movement of monks. If I were defining it, I would say it is seclusion from the outside world for the purpose or the pursuit of holiness. Monasticism became more common in really the 3rd and 4th century of the church. And we had people who were leaving their life in the cities and other ordinary places and going out to more remote places where they would form a community, a monastery, and pursue this life of holiness. Some of the ideas that motivated this just have to do with the definition of discipleship. So if discipleship is, as Jesus says it is in the Gospels, following him, give up our lives for him, take up the cross and follow him, as he says in Mark 8. The monastic movement, the going out and joining a monastery, provides a way to do that. In some ways, this monasticism was a revolt against the world. It's a rejection of worldly values, of wealth, of all the things that sort of define status in the kingdom of the world. There was a unique new situation that arose in the church in the 4th century, though. Constantine became emperor of Rome, and when he did, he began to favor the Christian religion. Near the end of the 4th century, in the year 380, the emperor made it the official religion of Rome. When that happened, you had something that you never had before in the church, and that is the rise of this phenomenon of what some would call nominal Christians. So before Constantine, if you were a Christian, you attended church, all that, you did so at great risk. At the least, you did it at the price of being socially marginalized. At most, you could be outright persecuted violently, even killed for being a Christian. And so you didn't have many people going to church for social advancement. You didn't have people going to church for entertainment purposes or to see their friends or that sort of thing. After eventually the official religion of Rome, now you have more people who are Christians. They may believe it, but it's also something that advances their social standing. It may help them now it may help their career to be a Christian. They might be a politician, they might be a business person or a merchant. That being a Christian now is an advantage for them. And so it's very difficult, one, to keep it from being what we might call a watered down Christianity and a watered down church, where you have people coming to church now to be seen by others and for social standing and advancement. You also have sort of a relaxing of commitment and morals in the church. Discipleship means taking up your cross and following Jesus, which means the willingness to suffer and die. What does that look like in a society where the official religion is Christianity, where everyone is a Christian, where suffering and at least state-sponsored persecution is a thing of the past? So getting back to the monks here, many of them saw this situation starting in the 4th century as the way to carry on this spiritual warfare. We can no longer literally give our lives for Christ. So, in persecution. Going out and in a voluntary way was seen as a way to engage the spiritual battle. And so not only is it sort of a critique of the world, but it becomes, after the 4th century, monasticism becomes a bit of a critique or even revolt against the worldly church, this institution that seemed now to some to be a little more compromised than it had been before. And so that's why the monasteries began to proliferate in the 4th century. It's also at this time, 4th, 5th century, when the Roman Empire, especially in the West, begins to crumble. So politically, socially, all of those institutions that drove Rome began to decline and eventually crumble. Of all those institutions of the ancient world that survived, there was really only one, and that is the church. From the late Empire into what we now think of as the Middle Ages. That's the one constant there. And if we're asking the question, who was it in the face of the crumbling civilization, the political chaos, the social disintegration of everything from kind of political structures to food, supply chain, all of these sort of things. Who was it that kept learning? Who kept learning on the kind of in the forefront and preserved those things in the light of civilization? It was the monks in the monasteries doing their scribal work, copying scripture for future generations like us to now take for granted, as well as I say, the learning of the pagan world before Christ. So they kept, we might say, the light of civilization burning. So the monks, even beyond the spiritual warfare and the prayer that they were engaged in, and all of these, the worship and the devotion to Christ that they were engaged in addition to that, they kind of kept culture alive in many ways. A key figure I'd like to emphasize here is, in Western monasticism anyway, is Benedict. And his version of monasticism is probably most famous because he composed or wrote a rule for the monastic house. So when it's just one monk, one hermit, they kind of have their own rules probably. But when, as it happened, you have a community of monks who come together, as you know, in any society, it's helpful to have some ground rules. Benedict is not the first one to write ground rules like this, but his was preserved and had became sort of a basis for monasteries for the next 1,000 years. He wrote it around the 540s, so he's early 6th century. So I would encourage Christians today, even now, to pick up the rule of Saint Benedict and read it. It's not that long, but it's very interesting. One is the structure that it provides for the brothers in the monastic house. They have 7 times during each day that are set aside as time for prayer. And there was structure in all of those, reading through the Psalms, reading these scriptures or those scriptures, times of silence and meditation, were a part of this. And then there were rules and sort of case instances of what to do with people who disobeyed. Some of it certainly you can take out of context and say, well, this really looks harsh. And overall, a very gracious and merciful set of rules and discipline. People always get second and third chances to do what they're supposed to be doing as a community that works and functions together. And the overall point of it is not just obedience to the abbot, the one who heads the monastic house, but of course obedience to God and really inculcating the virtue of humility. And all of these rules are for the purpose not just of following rules, okay? It's not rules as ends in themselves, but as means to teaching virtue and teaching what it means, again, to be a part of a community that is seeking the godly life. Benedict says, of course, I'm paraphrasing, but he says, of course, these rules are for the immature. He says, the point is not to follow these rules out of fear of punishment or whatever, but to follow these rules because they become habit to you. You delight in these. They become natural to you to follow these rules. You can see a monk in the early stages saying, oh my goodness, it's time for prayer again, and kind of rolling the eyes, those psalms again, I've heard them before. Where the mature monk can't wait for the hour of prayer and the reading of the psalms, and knows them, of course, by heart, and can't wait to be submissive to his fellow monks. That's the point. And so I think there's a lot just in monasticism and in the rule of Benedict in particular that could be helpful to us at a time when we're not really under voluntary, but really in some ways a forced quarantine. In some ways, Benedict volunteered for this. No one told him he has to go out and do this, but in some ways the circumstances forced it. As I said, the political and social circumstances were such that there were lots of hardships at this time in the 5th and 6th century of our era. And what Benedict provided, again, was a place of structure, a place of learning, a place of worship, making our own places of quarantine. In my case, it's my house. You've probably seen people coming up and down the stairs. There are people here. Is to make this an environment that has some structure in it, not just for the kids, but also for the adults. An environment where we can worship, an environment that, has some regulations, but also some mercy as well, an environment of learning, and maybe to form some habits that we should have had already that we may have neglected when it comes to worship and prayer. I was talking about this with my wife this morning. I can imagine if this sort of thing is happening all throughout, parents and kids kind of wondering how to handle this time. And we're sort of in a best position for this. She and I, we're both educators. We both have forced time at home with our kids. We know how to provide some instruction. Our kids are sort of on board with that, probably as much as anyone's kids. But we still find it very easy to slip into kind of an unstructured, okay, we have a TV, is the TV going to be turned on this whole time? What are we going to do about that? I think part of it because this happened at spring break. So it's kind of like just an extension of spring break here. And we don't have much structure during spring break, admittedly. And so we have a second and a third week of spring break. I think I want to take to heart also is some of that structure. I don't know if we have to have 7 hours set aside for prayer from before dawn until, through midnight. But a time of worship is good to set aside. It's good to have a structure there, because when we do go back to our normal lives and those rhythms that we're losing right now, we don't want it to be such a shock, that that it's hard for us to get back into those rhythms. So keeping some of those rhythms is a good thing. If you're like me, you don't know what today is because we've lost some of those daily and weekly rhythms. So it's so important to keep that Lord's Day rhythm for sure every week. So I think that, the thing I would take from this mostly is that being deliberate is really helpful. Being deliberate about our structure and about what we're doing with our time. So to use Paul's language of redeeming the time that we have, this is in some ways a forced Sabbath. And like the Sabbath in the Old Testament, it's also in many ways an economic Sabbath that could be painful. But God, I think, could be working through some of the bad circumstances if we have the eyes to see it, of what we might maintain, what we might preserve, and what new things we might be creative with. That structure and those sorts of things and, that I'm talking about, the worship, the learning, the being together, and being deliberate with that, I would like to see us extend past the quarantine as well. Because you may have noticed our society in many ways is our church, our faith as Christians is under attack in many ways from the society around us. And these kind of micro-monasteries we have in our homes, that those habits that we probably should be cultivating anyway, we need to continue even after the quarantine is over.